Sometimes the most powerful moments happen in the most ordinary places. A quiet coffee shop on a Tuesday morning. A parking lot outside a grocery store. A bus stop where strangers wait together, each lost in their own world. These are the places where humanity shows its true colors, where bullies reveal their cruelty and heroes step forward without fanfare. What you're about to read isn't a Hollywood script or a feel-good social media post designed to go viral. This is the raw, unfiltered account of what happened when a group of motorcycle riders thought they could humiliate someone they saw as an easy target. They chose the wrong person to mess with, and more importantly, they chose the wrong day to show their true nature in front of the wrong witnesses. In a world where people often look the other way, where bystanders become silent observers to injustice, this story reminds us that sometimes, just sometimes, the right people are in the right place at exactly the right moment. And when that happens, the bullies learn a lesson they'll never forget. The woman they targeted had already fought battles these men couldn't imagine. The men who stepped in had seen combat in places most people can't pronounce. But what unfolded that day wasn't about military training or physical strength. It was about something deeper. The unbreakable code that says you protect those who can't protect themselves, no matter who's watching, no matter what it costs you. This is their story. Every word is true. Sarah Martinez had learned to navigate the world on her own terms long before the accident that changed her life. At 32, she was a former marathon runner, a dedicated teacher, and someone who believed that every challenge was just another mountain to climb. That philosophy had carried her through her childhood in a tough neighborhood, through college on a partial scholarship, and through the early years of building her career. But nothing had prepared her for the drunk driver who ran a red light on that rainy October evening 3 years ago. The accident left her with a spinal cord injury that doctors said would confine her to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. The drunk driver walked away without a scratch and served only 18 months in prison. Sarah spent 6 months in the hospital and another year learning to rebuild her life from the ground up. The woman who had once run 26 miles for fun now had to relearn how to do simple things like getting dressed, cooking a meal, or navigating stairs. But Sarah Martinez was not someone who gave up easily. She returned to teaching, modified her classroom to accommodate her wheelchair, and threw herself into her work with even more passion than before. She became an advocate for disability rights in her spare time, speaking at schools and community centers about the importance of accessibility and inclusion. She refused to see herself as a victim and bristled when others treated her that way. On this particular Tuesday morning in late spring, Sarah was running errands before heading to school. She taught 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary, and today was the annual science fair. She had promised her students she would be there early to help them set up their projects, and she never broke a promise to her kids. She needed to stop at the pharmacy to pick up her prescription medication and grab some supplies from the hardware store for the science fair displays. The pharmacy visit went smoothly. Sarah had been going to the same location for years, and the staff knew her well. They always made sure the aisles were clear when they saw her coming, not out of pity, but out of the same courtesy they showed all their regular customers. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly pharmacist who had filled Sarah's prescriptions since she was a child, always asked about her students and remembered their names when Sarah shared stories about their achievements. The hardware store was a different matter. It was an older building that hadn't been updated to meet modern accessibility standards. The aisles were narrow, the shelves were high, and there was no automatic door. Sarah had called ahead to make sure they had what she needed in stock, and the manager had promised to have someone help her when she arrived. As she maneuvered her wheelchair through the parking lot, Sarah noticed a group of motorcycles parked near the entrance. 5 large bikes, all black and chrome, with leather saddlebags and loud exhaust pipes. She could hear the riders before she saw them, their voices carrying across the parking lot as they stood in a circle near their machines. The riders were dressed in matching leather vests with patches that proclaimed their allegiance to something called the Road Devils MC. They were all middle-aged men, heavily tattooed, with the kind of swagger that suggested they were used to intimidating people. The largest of the group, a man with a grey beard and arms like tree trunks, seemed to be their leader. He was telling a story that involved a lot of gesturing and crude language, and his companions were laughing at all the right moments. Sarah had encountered groups like this before. Most bikers were decent people who happened to love motorcycles, but there were always a few who used their appearance and numbers to bully others. She had learned to read the signs. The way they stood, the way they looked at people, the way they claimed territory in public spaces. These men had all the warning signs of trouble. She considered going to a different store, but she was already running late, and her students were counting on her. Besides, she refused to let anyone intimidate her into changing her plans. She had as much right to shop there as anyone else, and she wasn't going to let a group of middle-aged men on motorcycles dictate her choices. The hardware store's entrance had 3 steps leading up to a heavy glass door. Sarah had called ahead about this, and the manager had assured her that someone would be watching for her and would help her get inside. She positioned her wheelchair at the bottom of the steps and looked around for assistance. The motorcycle riders had noticed her arrival. She could feel their eyes on her as she waited, could hear their conversation shift from whatever crude story was being told to comments about her. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were talking about her, and it wasn't friendly. One of the younger riders, a man with bleached hair and multiple facial piercings, pointed in her direction and said something that made the others laugh. The sound wasn't the good-natured laughter of people enjoying a joke together. It was the mean-spirited laughter of people who found humor in someone else's misfortune. Sarah felt her face flush, but she kept her expression neutral. She had dealt with this before. The stares, the comments, the assumption that her wheelchair somehow made her less than human. She had developed a thick skin over the years, but it still stung. What bothered her most wasn't the cruelty itself, but the casual nature of it. These men didn't know her story, didn't know anything about her except that she used a wheelchair. And that was enough for them to decide she was worthy of their mockery. The hardware store manager, a thin man in his 50s named Bill, finally appeared at the door. He had been helping another customer and hadn't seen Sarah arrive. When he spotted her waiting at the bottom of the steps, his face immediately showed embarrassment. He hurried down to help her, apologizing for keeping her waiting. "I'm so sorry, Miss Martinez," he said, slightly out of breath. "I didn't see you pull up. Let me get the ramp from the back. It'll just take a minute." The portable ramp was stored behind the building, and Bill jogged around to get it. This left Sarah alone at the bottom of the steps, still within earshot of the motorcycle riders, who had grown bolder in their commentary. She could hear fragments now. "Probably can't even, and bet she needs help with," followed by more laughter. Sarah stared straight ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She had learned that engaging with people like this only escalated the situation. The best strategy was to ignore them completely, get her business done, and leave. But inside, she was angry. Angry at their cruelty, angry at their assumption that she couldn't hear them, angry at a world that still allowed this kind of behavior to pass without consequence. Bill returned with the ramp, a sturdy aluminum piece that he positioned carefully over the steps. He tested it to make sure it was secure, then stepped aside to let Sarah proceed. She thanked him quietly and began to roll up the ramp, maintaining her dignity despite the continued commentary from the peanut gallery behind her. That's when one of the riders decided to take things further. The bleached-haired man, who had first pointed her out, stepped away from his group and called out in a voice loud enough for everyone in the parking lot to hear, "Hey lady, you need someone to push you up that ramp? Looks like hard work." His companions erupted in laughter, and Sarah felt every muscle in her body tense. She was halfway up the ramp now, committed to the path forward, unable to turn around easily. The comment was designed to humiliate her, to make her feel helpless and dependent. It was the kind of fake offer of help that was really just another form of mockery. Sarah reached the top of the ramp and turned her wheelchair to face the parking lot. For the first time, she looked directly at the group of riders. The bleached-haired man was grinning at her, clearly pleased with himself for getting a rise out of his friends. The others were watching to see what she would do, whether she would respond to their provocation. "I'm fine, thank you," Sarah said calmly, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "I've been taking care of myself for quite a while now." Her response only seemed to encourage them. The leader of the group, the large man with the grey beard, stepped forward slightly. "That's real inspiring, darling," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Must be tough being all independent like that. Bet you miss the good old days when you could walk around like normal people." The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. It was cruel in a way that went beyond simple mockery. It was designed to remind her of her loss, to make her feel inferior, to reduce her to nothing more than her disability. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes and hated herself for the reaction. Bill, the hardware store manager, had been listening to the exchange with growing discomfort. He was a mild-mannered man who avoided confrontation whenever possible, but he couldn't stand by and watch a customer be treated this way. He cleared his throat and spoke up. "Excuse me, gentlemen, but I'm going to have to ask you to keep it down. We're trying to run a business here." The grey-bearded leader turned his attention to Bill, and his expression shifted from mocking amusement to genuine menace. "Mind your own business, shopkeeper," he said, his voice low and threatening. "We're just being friendly to the lady here. Isn't that right, sweetheart?" He directed the last comment back to Sarah, and she could see the calculation in his eyes. He was testing her, seeing how far he could push before she broke. These men fed on fear and helplessness, and they had identified her as an easy target. What they didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had been fighting battles her entire life, and she wasn't about to surrender to a group of bullies in a parking lot. But before she could respond, before the situation could escalate further, 3 men emerged from a pickup truck that had just pulled into the parking lot. They were dressed casually in jeans and t-shirts, but there was something about the way they moved, the way they immediately assessed the situation, that suggested they weren't ordinary customers. The 3 men were in their early 30s, fit and alert in a way that spoke of military training. They had been friends since their days in Navy SEAL Team 3, and though they were all civilians now, they maintained the brotherhood that had been forged in the crucible of combat. Today was supposed to be a simple shopping trip to buy supplies for a home renovation project, but they had walked into something that would test different skills entirely. Marcus Rodriguez was the first to notice the tension in the parking lot. He was a former SEAL medic who now worked as a paramedic in the city. His training had taught him to read situations quickly, to spot danger before it fully materialized. The body language of the motorcycle riders, the defensive posture of the woman in the wheelchair, the uncomfortable stance of the store manager, it all painted a picture that Marcus recognized immediately. His 2 companions, Jake Thompson and David Kim, picked up on his alertness and followed his gaze. Jake was a former communications specialist who now worked in cybersecurity, and David was an explosives expert who had transitioned to construction work. All 3 men had seen enough real conflict to recognize the difference between harmless banter and genuine bullying. They were too far away to hear the specific words being exchanged, but they could see the dynamic clearly enough. 5 large men on motorcycles were surrounding and intimidating a woman in a wheelchair and a nervous store employee. The math wasn't complicated, and the right course of action was obvious. The 3 former SEALs exchanged glances, and without a word being spoken, they began walking toward the hardware store entrance. They moved casually, without haste or aggression, but with the quiet confidence of men who had faced much worse situations and emerged victorious. They had no idea that their simple shopping trip was about to become something much more significant. Sarah saw them approaching and felt a flicker of hope. She didn't know who these men were or what they intended, but their presence changed the dynamic in the parking lot. The motorcycle riders sensed it too. The grey-bearded leader glanced over his shoulder at the 3 approaching men, and his expression shifted slightly. He was still confident in his numbers, still sure of his dominance, but some primitive instinct warned him that the situation was about to become more complicated. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the true character of everyone involved. Sarah Martinez, who had already proven her strength in ways these bullies couldn't imagine, was about to discover that sometimes, when you refuse to back down from injustice, the universe provides unexpected allies. And 5 men who thought they could intimidate anyone they chose were about to learn that some people don't intimidate easily, and some fights aren't worth picking. Marcus Rodriguez had learned to trust his instincts during 8 years as a Navy SEAL, and right now every instinct was telling him that the situation in front of the hardware store was about to get worse. As he and his teammates approached the group of motorcycle riders, he could see the tension building like pressure in a steam pipe. The woman in the wheelchair was holding her ground with admirable courage, but she was clearly outnumbered and vulnerable. The 3 former SEALs had been through enough combat situations to recognize the predatory behavior they were witnessing. The way the bikers had positioned themselves to block the woman's escape routes, the way they were using their size and numbers to intimidate, the casual cruelty of their taunts. It was textbook bullying behavior, and it triggered something deep in men who had sworn an oath to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Jake Thompson, walking slightly behind Marcus, felt his jaw clench as he overheard the grey-bearded biker's latest comment about the good old days when you could walk around like normal people. Jake's own sister had been born with cerebral palsy, and he had spent his childhood defending her from similar attacks. The memory of those schoolyard fights came flooding back, along with the rage he had felt then at people who saw weakness where they should have seen strength. David Kim said nothing, but his eyes were cataloguing details with the precision of a man trained to assess threats. 5 bikers, all larger than average, wearing patches that suggested they belonged to an organized motorcycle club. Leather vests that could conceal weapons, heavy boots that could be used as weapons themselves, and the kind of aggressive posture that suggested they were prepared for violence. But David also noticed other things: the way they stood too close together, limiting their ability to maneuver, the way their leader had positioned himself with his back to the approaching SEALs, the overconfidence that came from always picking fights they knew they could win. As the 3 men reached the edge of the confrontation, Marcus made the decision to intervene. He had hoped the bikers might back down when they saw witnesses approaching, but it was clear that wasn't going to happen. If anything, the presence of an audience seemed to be encouraging them to escalate their behavior. "Excuse me," Marcus said in a calm, clear voice that carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Is there a problem here?" The grey-bearded leader turned to face him, and Marcus could see the man's mind working, trying to decide whether these new arrivals represented a threat or just more potential victims. The biker was clearly used to intimidating people with his size and his gang's reputation, but something about Marcus's bearing gave him pause. "No problem at all, friend," the leader said, his tone deliberately condescending. "Just having a friendly conversation with the lady here. Nothing that concerns you." Marcus looked past the biker to Sarah, who was still positioned at the top of the ramp leading to the hardware store. Her face was flushed with anger and embarrassment, but her eyes held a dignity that reminded him of his mother, who had faced her own battles with grace and strength. "Ma'am," he said to Sarah, "are these gentlemen bothering you?" Before Sarah could answer, the bleached-haired biker who had started the harassment stepped forward aggressively. "Hey, military boy," he sneered, having apparently recognized something in Marcus's bearing that suggested armed forces training. "Why don't you and your buddies mind your own business before you get yourselves into something you can't handle?" The comment revealed more than the biker probably intended. The fact that he had immediately identified Marcus as military suggested these men had tangled with service members before, and the threat in his voice suggested those encounters hadn't always gone their way. But it also showed that they were too arrogant to learn from those experiences. Jake Thompson felt his temper flare at the dismissive tone, but he kept his voice level when he spoke. "Actually, it becomes our business when 5 grown men decide to gang up on one woman. Where I come from, that's called being a coward." The insult hit its mark. The biker's leader took a step toward Jake, his hands curling into fists. "You want to say that again, boy?" The situation was escalating rapidly, just as Marcus had feared it would. These men were committed to their course of action now, too invested in their dominance display to back down without losing face. But they had also revealed something important. They were bullies, who only attacked when they felt certain of victory. That overconfidence was about to become their weakness. "Look," David Kim said, stepping forward with his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Nobody wants any trouble here. Why don't we all just go about our business?" His reasonable tone seemed to confuse the bikers, who had been expecting an aggressive response. The leader looked from David to Marcus to Jake, trying to read the situation. These 3 men weren't backing down, but they also weren't escalating. It was a response pattern he wasn't used to dealing with. But one of the other bikers, a younger man with prison tattoos covering his forearms, wasn't interested in de-escalation. He had been drinking since early morning, and was looking for an excuse to prove himself to the older members of the club. "Forget this talking," he said, pulling a metal chain from his pocket. "Let's teach these heroes a lesson about minding their own business." The appearance of the weapon changed everything. What had been an ugly but potentially manageable confrontation was now a clear threat of violence. The hardware store manager, Bill, immediately backed away and pulled out his phone to call the police. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she realized the situation was spiraling out of control, but the 3 former SEALs didn't seem fazed by the escalation. If anything, they became calmer, more focused, as if the introduction of actual danger was something they were better equipped to handle than verbal intimidation. Marcus exchanged a quick glance with his teammates, and in that moment they communicated more than most people could with a 10-minute conversation. "Sir," Marcus said to the man with the chain, his voice taking on the tone of command that had once directed men in combat, "I strongly recommend you put that away before you do something you'll regret." The biker laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. Something about Marcus's absolute confidence was unsettling. "Oh yeah? What are you going to do about it, Jarhead?" What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but to everyone watching, it seemed to unfold in slow motion. The biker raised the chain to strike, but before he could complete the motion, Jake Thompson moved. His hand shot out in a simple, economical gesture that caught the biker's wrist and twisted it in a way that made the man's fingers go numb. The chain clattered to the pavement as Jake stepped back, having neutralized the threat without throwing a single punch. The demonstration of skill sent a shockwave through the group of bikers. They had expected a bar fight, a crude brawl where size and numbers would determine the outcome. What they had just witnessed was something entirely different, the kind of precise, controlled violence that spoke of serious training and experience. The grey-bearded leader found himself re-evaluating the situation. These weren't just 3 random civilians who had decided to play hero. These were men who knew how to fight, really fight, and they had just demonstrated that they could disable his people without breaking a sweat. For the first time since the confrontation began, he started to wonder if he had bitten off more than his gang could chew. But pride and reputation are powerful forces in the outlaw biker world, and backing down from 3 men in front of his crew would damage his authority within the club. He decided to try a different approach, one that relied more on intimidation than actual violence. "You boys have no idea what you're messing with," he said, his voice low and threatening. "We're road devils. That means something around here. You touch one of us, you're at war with all of us. There's a lot more of us than there are of you." David Kim almost smiled at the threat. During his time with SEAL Team 3, he had faced Taliban fighters, Al-Qaeda operatives, and Somali pirates. The idea that a small-time motorcycle club represented some kind of serious threat was almost amusing, but he also understood that these men were dangerous in their own way, particularly to civilians who couldn't defend themselves. "Here's what I think," David said calmly. "I think you picked on the wrong person today, and I think you're about to make it worse by continuing to threaten a woman who's done nothing to you except exist in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable about yourselves." The psychological accuracy of the comment stung. These men were bullying Sarah not because she had done anything wrong, but because her courage and independence reminded them of their own failures and weaknesses. They needed to tear her down to feel better about themselves, and David had called them out on it. Sarah herself was watching the confrontation with a mixture of gratitude and concern. She appreciated that these strangers were willing to stand up for her, but she also worried about what might happen if the situation turned violent. She had seen enough violence in her life, starting with her own accident, and she didn't want anyone else to get hurt because of her. "It's okay," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the tense space between the two groups. "I can handle this myself. You don't need to fight my battles for me." Marcus looked over at her, and in her eyes he saw the same fierce independence that had probably gotten her through every challenge in her life. But he also saw something else. The exhaustion that comes from having to fight those battles alone day after day, year after year. No one should have to endure constant harassment just for living their life. And he wasn't about to walk away and let it continue. "With respect, ma'am," he said, "this isn't about fighting your battles for you. This is about basic human decency. And right now, these men are failing that test pretty badly." The leader of the bikers was growing frustrated with the way the confrontation was developing. His attempts at intimidation weren't working. His crew member had been easily disarmed, and now his targets were having a philosophical discussion about human decency. The situation was slipping away from him, and he needed to reassert control. "Look, heroes," he said, taking another step forward. "You can stand there and talk all you want, but the fact is, you're outnumbered and outgunned. Walk away now, and we'll forget this ever happened. Keep pushing, and things are going to get real ugly real fast." It was a bluff, and everyone knew it. The bikers had already shown they weren't prepared for serious resistance, and the presence of witnesses made violence a risky proposition. But it was also an ultimatum that couldn't be ignored. Jake Thompson, who had been quietly observing the dynamics of the biker group, noticed something the others had missed. The man he had disarmed was cradling his wrist and looking uncertain about continuing the fight. 2 of the other bikers were hanging back, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was developing. Only the leader and 1 other man seemed committed to escalating the confrontation. "You know what I think," Jake said conversationally. "I think most of your crew would rather be somewhere else right now. I think they signed up for intimidating easy targets, not for getting into a real fight with people who know what they're doing." The comment exposed the fractures within the biker group. The younger members were indeed having second thoughts, realizing that their leaders had gotten them into a situation they weren't prepared for. The brotherhood that had seemed so strong when they were terrorizing a woman in a wheelchair was starting to crack under pressure. But the leader wasn't ready to concede defeat. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folding knife, opening it with a practiced flick of his wrist. The blade was 4 inches of sharp steel that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and its appearance shifted the confrontation into even more dangerous territory. "Last chance, heroes," he said, holding the knife low and ready. "Walk away, or we find out just how tough you really are." The blade didn't intimidate the 3 former SEALs, but it did concern them. They could handle themselves in a knife fight if necessary, but there was always the risk of serious injury, and they had civilians to protect. The hardware store manager was still nearby, Sarah was trapped at the top of the ramp, and other customers were beginning to gather in the parking lot. Marcus made a decision that drew on years of experience in crisis management. Instead of escalating to match the threat, he was going to de-escalate by forcing the biker leader to confront the consequences of his actions. "Sir," he said in a voice that carried absolute authority, I want you to think very carefully about what you're about to do. Right now, you're guilty of harassment and intimidation. If you use that knife, you're talking about assault with a deadly weapon, maybe attempted murder. Are you really willing to spend the next 10 years in prison to prove a point to a woman whose only crime was needing to shop for hardware? The question cut through the biker's anger and forced him to think rationally for the first time since the confrontation began. He was a man with an extensive criminal record who couldn't afford another serious conviction. The knife in his hand suddenly felt less like a weapon and more like a ticket to a prison cell. But he was also a man whose entire identity was built on never backing down from a fight, and the eyes of his crew were on him. The next few seconds would determine not just the outcome of this confrontation, but potentially the rest of his life. And in the distance, the sound of police sirens was growing steadily louder. The sound of approaching sirens seemed to freeze everyone in the parking lot like a photograph capturing a moment before everything changed. The grey-bearded biker leader stood with his knife still raised, his face showing the internal struggle between his pride and his survival instinct. His crew members were shifting nervously, some already taking subtle steps away from the confrontation, while others looked to him for direction. Marcus Rodriguez maintained his calm demeanor, but his mind was running through tactical assessments at lightning speed. The police would arrive in less than 2 minutes, which meant the situation needed to be resolved quickly to prevent any of the civilians from getting caught in the crossfire. He could see that the biker leader was wavering, torn between his need to maintain face in front of his crew and his growing realization that he had gotten himself into a situation he couldn't win. Sarah Martinez watched from her position at the top of the ramp, her hands gripping her wheelchair's armrest so tightly her knuckles were white. She felt responsible for the escalation of the situation, even though she knew intellectually that she had done nothing wrong. The harassment had started because of her presence, and now these brave strangers were potentially putting themselves in danger to protect her. She wanted to tell them to leave, to save themselves, but she also knew that their intervention was the only thing standing between her and whatever these men had planned. David Kim noticed that one of the younger bikers, a thin man with nervous eyes, was reaching slowly towards his jacket pocket. David's experience with improvised explosive devices had taught him to watch for subtle movements that others might miss, and this one suggested the man was going for a weapon. Without drawing attention to himself, David began shifting position to neutralize this potential threat if necessary. The hardware store manager, Bill, had retreated to what he hoped was a safe distance and was speaking urgently into his phone with the 911 dispatcher. He was giving them a detailed description of the situation, the number of people involved, and the fact that weapons had been produced. He could hear the tension in the dispatcher's voice as she relayed information to the responding officers and called for backup. Jake Thompson, meanwhile, was focused on the psychology of the moment. His training had taught him that most violent confrontations could be resolved without bloodshed if you understood what the aggressor really wanted. In this case, the biker leader wanted respect, dominance, and a way to maintain his authority in front of his crew. Jake needed to give him a path to disengage that didn't feel like surrender. "You know," Jake said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than standing on the edge of violence, "my grandfather rode with a motorcycle club back in the 60s. Real old-school brotherhood. They had a code about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, especially women and children. He used to say that's what separated real bikers from the wannabes and posers." The comment was calculated to appeal to the leader's sense of identity while simultaneously challenging it. If he wanted to see himself as part of an authentic motorcycle tradition, Jake was offering him a way to do that by walking away. But if he continued with his current course of action, he would be identifying himself as exactly the kind of person that authentic bikers look down on. The grey-bearded man's expression shifted slightly, and Marcus recognized the look. It was the expression of someone trying to find a way out of a corner they had painted themselves into. The knife was still in his hand, but his grip had loosened, and the blade was no longer pointed at anyone in particular. One of the other bikers, an older man with graying hair who had been quiet throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Come on, Tank," he said to the leader, using what was apparently a club nickname. "This isn't what we came here for. Let's just ride." The comment revealed the fractures within the group that Jake had identified earlier. Not all of these men were comfortable with what their leader was doing, and at least some of them were looking for an excuse to disengage. The older biker's intervention provided Tank with the cover he needed to back down without losing face entirely. But Tank wasn't ready to concede yet. He looked around the parking lot, taking in the growing crowd of witnesses, the approaching police sirens, and the 3 men who had shown they weren't intimidated by his usual tactics. He was a man used to getting his way through intimidation and violence, and the failure of those methods left him feeling powerless and angry. "You think you're real smart, don't you?"
he said to Marcus, his voice heavy with frustration.
Coming in here playing hero, making us look bad in front of everyone. You have no idea what you're messing with. This isn't over. Marcus nodded calmly. You're right, he said. I am messing with something and I know exactly what it is. I'm messing with 5 men who decided to entertain themselves by hurting someone who never did anything to them. And you're right about something else too. This doesn't have to be over. You can put the knife away, apologize to the lady, and ride away. Or you can wait for the police to show up and explain to them why you thought threatening people with a weapon was a good idea. Your choice. The sirens were much closer now, and Tank could see the flashing lights reflecting off the windows of nearby buildings. He was running out of time to make a decision, and his options were narrowing rapidly. If he used the knife, he would be looking at serious prison time. If he backed down publicly, his authority within the club would be damaged. Either way, he was going to lose something important. Sarah decided to break the deadlock herself. Despite her fear, despite the knife, despite the very real danger of the situation, she rolled her wheelchair closer to the edge of the ramp and spoke directly to Tank. You want to know what I think? She said, her voice steady and clear. I think you're scared. I think you see me living my life, refusing to give up, refusing to hide, and it reminds you that you've given up on yourself. I think you look at these 3 men who stepped up to help a stranger, and it reminds you that you've never had that kind of courage. And I think that's why you need to hurt me. Because watching other people be strong makes you feel weak. The words hit Tank like physical blows. Every sentence was a direct challenge to his self-image. Every accusation a mirror reflecting truths he didn't want to acknowledge. She was calling him a coward in front of his crew, in front of witnesses, in front of men he was supposed to be intimidating. The rage that boiled up in him was almost overwhelming, but something else happened too. As he looked at Sarah Martinez, really looked at her, not just saw her wheelchair, but saw the person who had overcome more challenges in 3 years than he had faced in his entire life. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years. Shame. Real deep shame for what he was doing and what he had become. The moment of recognition was interrupted by the arrival of the first police car. Officer Janet Rodriguez, no relation to Marcus, was a 15-year veteran of the force, who had responded to more domestic disputes, bar fights, and parking lot confrontations than she could count. She immediately assessed the situation. 5 bikers, 3 civilians, weapons visible, and a woman in a wheelchair who appeared to be the focus of the confrontation.
Everyone stay where you are, she called out as she exited her patrol car, her hand resting on her service weapon but not yet drawing it.
Nobody move, nobody talk until I figure out what's going on here. Tank looked at the police officer, then at his crew, then at the 3 former SEALs, who were watching him with expressions of calm readiness. He could still use the knife, could try to fight his way out of the situation, but he knew how that would end. He had been in enough prison fights to recognize genuine dangerous men when he saw them, and these 3 had that quality in abundance. More importantly, Sarah's words were still echoing in his mind. She had stripped away all his justifications and rationalizations and shown him exactly what he was, a middle-aged man who bullied disabled women to feel better about himself. It wasn't a flattering self-portrait, and it wasn't one he wanted to live with. To none, with a sudden movement that made everyone tense, Tank folded the knife and put it back in his pocket. The gesture was met with visible relief from his crew members, who had been dreading the inevitable escalation that would have followed if he had chosen violence. There's no problem here, officer, Tank said, his voice carefully controlled. Just a misunderstanding that got out of hand. We were just leaving. Officer Rodriguez was too experienced to accept such a simple explanation. She could see the tension in everyone's posture, could read the signs of a confrontation that had barely avoided turning violent. But she also knew that if everyone was willing to walk away, it was better than having to sort out the aftermath of a brawl. I'm going to need to speak with everyone involved, she said firmly. Starting with you, ma'am. She nodded towards Sarah. Can you tell me what happened here? Sarah looked at Tank, who was watching her with an expression that was hard to read. She could press charges, could tell the officer about the harassment and the threats, could make sure these men faced consequences for their actions. It would be justified and it might prevent them from targeting someone else in the future. But she could also see something in Tank's eyes that hadn't been there before. The recognition of what he had become, and perhaps the beginning of shame about it. She thought about her students, about the lessons she tried to teach them, about forgiveness and second chances, about the possibility of redemption even for people who had made terrible choices. There was a verbal disagreement, Sarah said carefully. Some harsh words were exchanged. But these gentlemen, she nodded toward Marcus, Jake, and David, helped de-escalate the situation. I don't think anyone wants to pursue this any further. The response surprised everyone. Perhaps most of all, Tank himself. He had expected her to press charges, to use the legal system to punish him for his behavior. The fact that she was offering him a way out, even after everything he had put her through, was something he hadn't anticipated. Marcus, Jake, and David exchanged glances, understanding that Sarah was making a choice that went beyond simple justice. She was choosing to believe in the possibility of change, even in people who had shown themselves at their worst. It was an act of grace that highlighted the difference between her character and that of her tormentors. Officer Rodriguez looked around the group, reading the body language and the unspoken communications between them. She could tell there was more to the story than she was hearing, but she also recognized that sometimes the best outcome was the one that allowed everyone to walk away with their dignity intact. "All right," she said finally. "But I want everyone to understand something. This parking lot has security cameras, and there are multiple witnesses to whatever happened here. If I get called back for the same kind of problem, if anyone decides to continue this somewhere else, if there's any kind of retaliation or follow-up, I'm going to review that footage and press charges based on what I see. Is that understood?" Everyone nodded, though Tank's nod was more reluctant than the others. He was still processing Sarah's unexpected mercy, still trying to understand why she had chosen to let him walk away rather than destroy him. It was a kindness he wasn't sure he deserved, and that uncertainty was eating at him. The older biker who had suggested they leave earlier stepped forward slightly. "Officer, we understand completely. This was a mistake that won't be repeated. You have our word on that." His intervention seemed to break the spell that had held Tank frozen in place. The leader of the Road Devils looked one more time at Sarah, and for a moment it seemed like you might say something. An apology, perhaps, or some acknowledgement of what had transpired. But the words didn't come, and after a few seconds he simply turned and walked toward his motorcycle. The other bikers followed his lead, moving quickly but not running, clearly eager to put distance between themselves and a situation that had spiraled far beyond their comfort zone. They started their bikes with unnecessary revving of engines, a final display of bravado to cover their retreat, and rode out of the parking lot in formation. As the sound of their motorcycles faded into the distance, Officer Rodriguez turned her attention to the remaining participants in the confrontation. She took brief statements from Marcus, Jake, and David, noting their military backgrounds and their assessment of the situation. She spoke with Bill, the hardware store manager, who confirmed the general outline of events and mentioned that he had security footage available if needed. Finally, she returned to Sarah, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the entire ordeal. "Are you sure you don't want to press charges?" the officer asked. "What happened here was harassment at minimum, possibly assault given the weapons that were displayed. You have every right to pursue this." Sarah considered the question carefully. Part of her wanted justice, wanted these men to face consequences for their actions so they might think twice before targeting someone else. But another part of her recognized that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred was not punishment, but forgiveness. Not retaliation, but grace. "I'm sure," she said finally. "But I appreciate you asking. And I appreciate knowing that you take this kind of thing seriously." Officer Rodriguez nodded, though she still seemed somewhat puzzled by Sarah's decision. She had seen too many victims who had been failed by a system that didn't protect them, and she worried about setting a precedent that might encourage future harassment. But she also respected Sarah's right to make her own choices about how to handle the situation. As the police officer finished her paperwork and prepared to leave, Marcus approached Sarah's wheelchair. He wanted to say something about her courage, about the grace she had shown in the face of cruelty, about the way she had handled herself throughout the confrontation. But he also sensed that she might not want to be praised for simply living her life with dignity. "That was quite something," he said simply. "The way you handled that situation." Sarah looked up at him, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she allowed herself to smile. "I've had a lot of practice," she said. "Unfortunately." The comment was sad and honest, a reminder that what had happened today was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of harassment that people with disabilities faced regularly. It made Marcus's respect for her courage even deeper, understanding that she dealt with ignorance and cruelty not just once, but repeatedly, and had chosen not to let it break her spirit. Jake and David joined them, and for a moment the four of them stood together in the parking lot, an unlikely group brought together by circumstance and united by their response to injustice. They had all been changed by the experience in different ways, though they were only beginning to understand how. 3 hours later, Sarah Martinez was sitting in her classroom at Lincoln Elementary, watching her fourth-grade students set up their science fair projects with the kind of focused intensity that only 9-year-old children could muster. The morning's confrontation felt like something from another world, a harsh intrusion of adult cruelty into the innocent space where she spent most of her time. Her students were blissfully unaware of what their teacher had endured earlier. They were absorbed in arranging their displays about volcano eruptions, plant growth experiments, and solar system models. Sarah found their enthusiasm healing after the ugliness of the parking lot encounter. This was why she taught, why she had fought so hard to return to the classroom after her accident, to be part of something positive and hopeful. But she couldn't entirely shake the memory of the confrontation, particularly the moment when those 3 strangers had stepped forward to help her. In her experience, most people looked away when they witnessed harassment, convincing themselves it wasn't their business or that someone else would intervene. The willingness of Marcus, Jake, and David to get involved, even at personal risk, had surprised her almost as much as their obvious competence in handling the situation. What surprised her even more was her own decision to let the bikers walk away without pressing charges. She had always believed in accountability, in the importance of consequences for harmful behavior. Her decision to show mercy to Tank and his crew felt out of character, yet somehow right in a way she couldn't fully explain. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Rodriguez was having a conversation with his supervisor at the paramedic station that he hadn't expected to have when he woke up that morning. Word of the hardware store incident had somehow reached the department, and Captain Williams wanted to understand exactly what had happened. "So let me get this straight," the captain said, leaning back in his desk chair. "You and the Thompson twins decided to play hero in a parking lot confrontation?" Marcus smiled at the reference to Jake and David, who had been inseparable since their SEAL days and were known throughout their circle as the twins, despite being unrelated and looking nothing alike. "We didn't go looking for trouble, Cap. We were just picking up supplies for Jake's kitchen renovation when we saw 5 guys harassing a woman in a wheelchair." "What would you have done?" Captain Williams was quiet for a moment. He was a former Marine himself, and he understood the instinct to protect civilians from bullies. But he also had to worry about liability, about his people getting involved in situations that could result in lawsuits or worse. "Did it occur to you that these might have been dangerous men?"
That you could have been seriously hurt or worse? Marcus considered the question.
To be honest, Cap, they weren't as dangerous as they thought they were. A lot of noise and posturing, but when push came to shove, they weren't prepared for real resistance.
"Besides, we couldn't just walk away and let them continue terrorizing that woman." The captain nodded slowly. He had read the police report, had seen that no charges were filed and no one was injured. From a departmental perspective, the incident was closed, but he was curious about something else. "What was your read on the woman, the one they were hassling?" "Tough," Marcus said without hesitation. "Tougher than any of those bikers, that's for sure. She handled herself with more dignity and grace than I've seen from most people in crisis situations. And when she had the chance to press charges, to really make them pay for what they did, she chose to let them walk away. I'm still trying to figure out why." At that same moment, Jake Thompson was having a similar conversation with his cybersecurity team at the firm where he worked as a consultant. His colleagues had heard about the incident through the informal network that connected military veterans in the city, and they wanted details. "Dude, you're like a magnet for this stuff," said Tom Chen, a former Army intelligence officer who worked in the cubicle next to Jake's. "Didn't you break up a bar fight last month?" Jake shook his head. "That was different." This was just wrong on every level. 5 against 1, picking on someone because of her disability. Trying to humiliate her in public. It reminded me of every playground bully I ever wanted to punch in the face. "And did you?" "Punch anyone in the face, I mean. Didn't have to. Sometimes just showing people that they're not the biggest fish in the pond is enough to make them reconsider their choices." These guys were all about intimidation, but they folded pretty quickly when they realized they had picked the wrong fight. Tom nodded, understanding the dynamic.
What about the woman?
How did she handle it? Jake was quiet for a moment, remembering Sarah's composure under pressure, the way she had faced down her tormentors with quiet dignity. She was incredible, brave, smart, and tough as nails. And then, when she had every right to throw the book at these guys, she chose mercy instead. I'm not sure I would have been that generous in her position. David Kim, meanwhile, was at a construction site on the other side of the city, trying to focus on the foundation work his crew was pouring, but finding his mind wandering back to the morning's events. His foreman, a gruff ex-Navy man named Pete Sullivan, had noticed his distraction. "You're somewhere else today, Kim," Pete observed during their lunch break. "Everything okay?" David found himself telling the story. describing the confrontation and its unexpected resolution. Pete listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When David finished, Pete was quiet for a long moment. "You know what gets me about stories like that?" Pete said finally. "It's not the bullies. There are always going to be bullies. It's the fact that most people just walk by, pretend they don't see what's happening. It takes a special kind of person to step up, especially when it's not your fight. It became our fight the moment they decided to gang up on someone who couldn't fight back," David said. "That's not complicated math." "No," Pete agreed. "But not everyone can do that math. Most people are too scared, or too worried about getting sued, or too convinced that it's not their problem. The fact that you and your buddies stepped up says something about who you are." Across town, at Lincoln Elementary, Sarah was having her own conversation about the morning's events, though not by choice. Principal Janet Morrison had heard about the incident through the school district's informal communication network and wanted to make sure Sarah was okay. "I wish you had called me," Principal Morrison said as she sat in one of the small chairs in Sarah's classroom, looking somewhat ridiculous, but determined to have the conversation at eye level. "The district has resources for situations like this. Security, counseling, legal support if you need it." Sarah appreciated the concern, but she also felt a familiar frustration with the assumption that she needed special protection or accommodation. "I handled it fine, Janet, and honestly, it was probably less traumatic than some of the parent conferences we've had this year." Principal Morrison smiled despite her concern. Sarah's dry sense of humor was one of the things that made her such an effective teacher. Kids responded to her authenticity, her refusal to be defined by her wheelchair, her ability to find lightness even in difficult situations. "Still," the principal persisted, "harassment is harassment. You shouldn't have to deal with that kind of behavior just for trying to run errands." "You're right, I shouldn't, but I do, and I will again, because that's the reality of living with a visible disability in a world where too many people see it as a character flaw rather than just a fact of life. The question isn't how to avoid those situations entirely, it's how to handle them with dignity when they arise." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the classroom door. Sarah looked up to see Marcus Rodriguez standing in the doorway, looking somewhat uncertain about whether he should be there. He was still wearing his paramedic uniform, having stopped by during his lunch break. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "I just wanted to check on you, make sure you were okay after this morning." Principal Morrison looked from Sarah to Marcus with obvious curiosity. Sarah made introductions, explaining briefly how they had met. The principal's expression shifted from confusion to understanding, to something approaching awe as she realized she was meeting one of the men who had intervened in the parking lot confrontation. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, standing to shake his hand, "I can't tell you how grateful we are for what you did. Sarah is one of our most valuable teachers, and the thought of someone trying to hurt or intimidate her is just..." She trailed off, apparently unable to find adequate words for her outrage. Marcus felt slightly uncomfortable with the praise. In his mind, he and his teammates had simply done what any decent person would do in the same situation. The idea that such basic human decency was noteworthy enough to deserve special recognition bothered him. "I just wanted to make sure Ms. Martinez was doing okay," he said. "What happened this morning was pretty intense, and sometimes the stress hits people later, after the adrenaline wears off." Sarah studied his face, recognizing the genuine concern in his expression. It occurred to her that he probably dealt with trauma victims regularly in his job as a paramedic, that he understood the delayed effects of stress and conflict in ways most people didn't. "I'm fine," she assured him. "Honestly, it wasn't the worst thing that's ever happened to me. Not even close." The comment hung in the air, and Marcus found himself wondering about her story, about the worst things that had shaped her perspective on the morning's harassment. He could see strength in her that went beyond simple courage, a resilience that spoke of surviving challenges that would have broken lesser people. Principal Morrison excused herself, citing meetings to attend, but not before inviting Marcus to visit the school again under happier circumstances. When they were alone, Sarah gestured for Marcus to take a seat in one of the student chairs. "This is going to sound strange," she said, "but I keep thinking about something that happened during the confrontation. When that man, Tank, was holding the knife, there was a moment where I thought he might actually use it. But you and your friends, you never seemed scared, not even when he escalated to weapons." Marcus considered how to answer. The truth was that he and his teammates had faced much more serious threats during their military service. Situations where the stakes were life and death and the enemy was well trained and well equipped. A handful of motorcycle club members with attitude problems didn't register as particularly dangerous in comparison. But he also understood that for most civilians, the threat of violence was genuinely terrifying, and his casual response to it might seem callous or dismissive. I guess we've been in situations where the danger was more immediate and serious, he said carefully. But that doesn't mean we took this morning lightly. Weapons make any situation dangerous, and there were a lot of ways it could have gone wrong. What kind of situation? Sarah asked, then immediately shook her head. Sorry, that's probably not something you want to talk about. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering how much to share. Most civilians didn't really understand what military service involved, particularly the kind of special operations work he had done with SEAL Team 3. The missions, the training, the constant exposure to violence and death. It was a world apart from the daily concerns of teachers and paramedics. But something about Sarah's directness, her refusal to avoid difficult topics, encouraged honesty. My teammates and I were Navy SEALs, he said simply. We spent a lot of time in places where people were actively trying to kill us. It changes your perspective on what constitutes a real threat. Sarah nodded slowly, pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. The way the three men had moved, the casual confidence with which they had faced down armed opponents, the tactical awareness she had sensed even as a civilian observer, it all made sense now. That explains a lot, she said, including why you chose to help a stranger. I imagine you took an oath about protecting people. We did, Marcus agreed. But honestly, you don't need military training to know that harassment is wrong. You don't need special skills to stand up for someone who's being bullied. Most people just choose not to get involved. Why do you think I chose not to press charges? Sarah asked suddenly. Everyone seems puzzled by that decision, including me. I believe in accountability and consequences for harmful behavior, so why did I let them walk away? Marcus had been wondering the same thing since the confrontation ended. He had seen the hurt in her eyes, had witnessed the cruelty of the harassment, had watched her endure humiliation and threats with remarkable composure. By all rights, she should have wanted justice. Maybe, he said slowly, because you recognize that real justice isn't always about punishment. Maybe because you saw something in that man Tank that suggested he was capable of learning from what happened. Maybe because you're strong enough to choose mercy even when you have every right to choose revenge. The words resonated with something deep in Sarah's understanding of herself and her values. She thought about her students, about the lessons she tried to teach them, about forgiveness and second chances, about the possibility of growth and change even in people who had made terrible mistakes. There was a moment, she said quietly, when he was holding that knife, when I could see him really looking at me for the first time, not just seeing the wheelchair, but seeing me. I think he realized what he had become, what he was doing, and I thought maybe, just maybe, that realization might be worth more than whatever punishment the legal system could provide. Marcus felt a deep respect for her wisdom, for her ability to see beyond the immediate hurt to something larger and more hopeful. It was the kind of moral courage that was rarer than physical bravery, the strength to respond to hatred with grace. Their conversation was interrupted by the return of Sarah's students from lunch recess. 24 fourth graders poured into the classroom with the kind of energy that could power a small city. Chattering about playground adventures and excited about the afternoon science fair presentations, Marcus watched Sarah transform as her students entered, her entire demeanor shifting to accommodate their needs and energy. She became more animated, more focused on the immediate concerns of young minds eager to share their discoveries about the natural world. Ms. Martinez, called out a small girl with pigtails. My volcano is going to be the best eruption ever. I added extra baking soda just like you showed me. I'm excited to see it, Emma, Sarah replied warmly. Remember, it's not about having the biggest reaction, it's about understanding the science behind what's happening. As Marcus prepared to leave, he found himself thinking about the contrast between the cruel world of parking lot harassment and the hopeful world of elementary education. Sarah moved between these worlds daily, maintaining her faith in human potential despite regular evidence of human cruelty. It was a remarkable balancing act, one that required strength he was only beginning to appreciate. Before he left, he wrote his phone number on a piece of paper and handed it to Sarah. In case you ever need anything, he said simply, or if you just want to talk to someone who understands that sometimes the world is uglier than it should be. Sarah took the paper, understanding that it represented something more than a simple exchange of contact information. It was an acknowledgement that they had shared an experience that had changed them both, a recognition that sometimes strangers become connected in ways that neither expects nor fully understands. As Marcus walked back to his ambulance, he found himself thinking about courage and kindness, about the difference between responding to hatred with more hatred and responding to it with something better. Sarah Martinez had taught him something today that his military training never could have. That sometimes the strongest response to violence is grace. And the true victory isn't about defeating your enemies, but about refusing to become like them. 6 months after the hardware store confrontation, the ripple effects of that morning were still spreading through the lives of everyone involved, though not always in ways they could have predicted. The incident had become a turning point, a moment that revealed character and changed perspectives in ways both large and small. Sarah Martinez had continued teaching at Lincoln Elementary, but her approach to her disability advocacy work had evolved significantly. The morning's events had crystallized something for her about the power of grace in the face of hatred, and she had begun incorporating that philosophy into her speaking engagements at schools and community centers. She was currently standing in front of a room full of high school students, sharing her story not just as a cautionary tale about drunk driving or inspiration about overcoming adversity, but as a lesson about choosing how to respond when the world shows you its worst face. The question isn't whether you'll encounter cruelty in your life, she told the assembled teenagers. You will. The question is what you'll do with it when it happens. Will you let it make you smaller, meaner, more afraid? Will you use it as justification for becoming cruel yourself? Or will you find a way to transform it into something better? One student, a girl with purple hair and multiple piercings, who looked like she had faced her own share of judgment and harassment, raised her hand. But didn't it just teach those guys that they could get away with treating people badly? I mean, if there are no consequences, why would they change? It was a question Sarah had grappled with many times since that morning. She had wondered whether her decision to show mercy had been naive, whether Tank and his crew had learned anything from the encounter, or simply seen it as permission to continue their behavior. That's a fair question, Sarah said, and I don't have a perfect answer. But I can tell you what I've learned since then. Sometimes consequences come in forms we don't expect, and sometimes the most powerful changes happen inside people rather than outside them.
What Sarah didn't tell the students because she was still processing it herself
Was that 2 months earlier she had received an unexpected visitor at her school. Tank had shown up during her lunch break, wearing clean clothes and a nervous expression, asking if he could speak with her privately. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult and surprising of Sarah's life. Tank had told her about the sleepless nights following their confrontation, about the way her words had echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront truths about himself that he had been avoiding for years. He had talked about his childhood, about the abuse and neglect that had shaped his understanding of strength and weakness, about the way he had learned to see violence as the only language that mattered. More importantly, he had apologized. Not the casual, grudging apology of someone trying to avoid consequences, but the deep, painful acknowledgement of someone who had finally seen himself clearly and didn't like what he found. He had told her about the anger management classes he had started attending, about his decision to leave the Road Devils MC, about his attempts to make amends for years of harmful behavior. The apology hadn't fixed everything, hadn't erased the hurt he had caused or the fear Sarah had felt during their confrontation, but it had validated her decision to choose mercy over revenge, had shown her that sometimes people really were capable of change, even when that change seemed impossible. Tank himself was working at an auto repair shop across town, trying to rebuild his life from the ground up. Leaving the motorcycle club had cost him most of his social connections, and starting over at 52 was harder than he had expected. But he was committed to becoming someone better than the man who had threatened a disabled woman in a parking lot because it made him feel powerful. His former crew members had scattered to other clubs or dropped out of the biker scene entirely. The younger man who had produced the change during the confrontation had been arrested 2 months later in an unrelated incident and was currently serving time for assault. The older biker who had urged Tank to walk away that morning had become something of a mentor to Tank in his efforts to change, proving that even within the Road Devils there had been men who understood the difference between strength and cruelty. Marcus Rodriguez had also been changed by the morning's events, though in subtler ways. His job as a paramedic had always involved protecting and helping people, but the hardware store incident had reminded him that protection sometimes required stepping outside the boundaries of official duty. He had begun volunteering with a local organization that provided self-defense classes for people with disabilities, sharing his military training in service of civilian empowerment. Today, he was teaching a wheelchair self-defense class at the community center, working with a group of students that included 2 veterans who had lost limbs in combat, a woman who had been paralyzed in a car accident, and a man with cerebral palsy who was tired of being seen as an easy target. The most important thing to remember, Marcus told his students, is that your wheelchair isn't a limitation, it's a platform. You're not helpless, you're mobile. You have advantages that standing opponents don't, and techniques that can level any playing field. He demonstrated a move where a wheelchair user could use their chair's momentum to break free from a grab, then showed how the chair itself could become a defensive weapon. But more than the physical techniques, he was teaching attitude and confidence, the kind of mental preparation that could prevent confrontations from escalating in the first place. One of his students was Maria Santos, a young woman who had been born with spina bifida and used a wheelchair full-time. She had been inspired to take the class after hearing about Sarah's story through the disability community's informal network. "I've always been afraid of situations like what happened to that teacher," Maria confided during a break. "I mean, what do you do when people decide you're an easy target? How do you make them understand that you're not helpless?" Marcus thought about Sarah's response to that same situation, about the way she had faced down her tormentors with dignity and grace. "You show them who you really are," he said. "Not through violence necessarily, but through strength. Through refusing to be diminished by their ignorance. Through making it clear that their opinion of you doesn't define your worth." Jake Thompson had channeled his experience from that morning into his cybersecurity work, but in an unexpected direction. He had become involved in online safety education, teaching people how to protect themselves from digital harassment and cyberbullying. The connection might not have been obvious to outsiders, but for Jake the link was clear. Whether the harassment happened in a parking lot or on social media, it was about powerful people targeting those they perceived as vulnerable. He was currently presenting to a group of teachers about online safety for students with disabilities, explaining how cyberbullies often targeted young people who were already marginalized or struggling. "The tactics are different online," he explained, "but the psychology is the same. Predators look for targets who seem isolated, who appear unable to fight back, who can be easily overwhelmed. The key is teaching kids that they're not alone, that there are people who will step up for them, that they have more power than they think." One teacher asked about the difference between online intervention and the kind of real-world situation he had been involved in at the hardware store. Jake considered the question carefully. "In both cases," he said, "it's about changing the math. Bullies rely on having advantages, numbers, surprise, the assumption that no one will help their victim. When you change those factors, when you show up as an ally, when you make it clear that there will be consequences for harmful behavior, you shift the entire dynamic." David Kim had taken his experience in a different direction entirely. He had started a non-profit organization that provided home modifications and accessibility improvements for disabled veterans, using his construction skills to create practical solutions for people adapting to life with new limitations. Currently, he was working on a bathroom renovation for a Marine who had lost both legs to an IED in Afghanistan. The project involved installing grab bars, lowering countertops, and creating roll-in shower access. Technical challenges that David approached with the same precision he had once applied to explosive devices. "The thing about accessibility," he explained to his volunteer crew, "is that it's not charity, it's dignity. When someone can't access their own bathroom independently, when they can't cook in their own kitchen, when they can't enter their own home without help, that's not just inconvenient, it's dehumanizing." The veteran they were helping, Staff Sergeant Jimmy Collins, had initially been resistant to accepting help. Like many combat veterans, he struggled with the transition from being someone who protected others to someone who needed protection himself. But David's approach was different from the well-meaning volunteers who had tried to help before. "I'm not here because I feel sorry for you," David had told him bluntly. "I'm here because you've earned the right to live independently, and society owes you the tools to make that possible. This isn't charity, it's justice." The words had resonated with Collins, who recognized in David someone who understood the warrior's code, the importance of maintaining dignity even in the face of devastating loss. Their working relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship, based on mutual respect rather than pity. As David installed the final grab bar in Collins's shower, he found himself thinking about the morning at the hardware store, about Sarah's courage, and the way she had transformed a moment of potential violence into something more hopeful. He realized that all the work he was doing now, all the homes he was modifying, and the veterans he was helping, could be traced back to that encounter, to the recognition that sometimes the strongest people are those who have learned to adapt to circumstances they never chose. The science fair at Lincoln Elementary had been a tremendous success, and Sarah's students had gone on to win several district-level competitions. But more importantly, they had learned lessons about perseverance and curiosity that would serve them well beyond 4th grade. Sarah often thought about how the morning's traumatic events had somehow enhanced her ability to teach these lessons, how surviving hatred had deepened her appreciation for innocence and hope. Today, she was preparing for a visit from Marcus, Jake, and David, the first time the 4 of them would be in the same room since the hardware store incident. They had stayed in touch through occasional phone calls and text messages, but this would be the first opportunity to really talk about how that morning had changed all of their lives. The three men arrived at the school together, having met for lunch before coming to see Sarah's classroom. They were struck by the environment she had created. Colorful, welcoming, full of student artwork and science projects that spoke to young minds exploring the world around them. It was a sharp contrast to the harsh reality of the parking lot where they had first met. Sarah's students had gone home for the day, leaving the classroom quiet and spacious. She had arranged chairs in a circle, creating an informal setting for what she knew would be an important conversation. "I've been thinking a lot about that morning," Sarah began once they were all seated. "Not just about what happened, but about why it happened and what it meant. I keep coming back to the idea that it wasn't random, that somehow we were all supposed to be there, supposed to meet.